September 7th, 1303. The town of Anagni, in the hills southeast of Rome. It is early morning when the soldiers appear. They number in the hundreds, French troops and Italian mercenaries, led by Guillaume de Nogaret, chief minister of Philip IV of France, and by Chiara Colonna, a member of the great Roman family that has been the sworn enemy of the reigning pope for 6 years. They break into town. They smash through the gates of the papal palace. They find the old man alone in a vaulted chamber, seated on his throne, wearing his papal robes, the tiara on his head, and the cross in his hands. The French chancellor and the Colonnas demanded the pope's abdication. Boniface VIII responded that he would sooner die. In response, Colonna allegedly slapped Boniface, a slap historically remembered as the Schiaffo di Anagni, the Anagni slap. Whether the blow was an actual slap or a symbolic strike with a gauntlet, the historical meaning is the same. The Vicar of Christ, the man who had proclaimed himself the supreme authority over every king and emperor on earth. The Pope who had issued perhaps the most audacious document in the entire history of the medieval papacy. This man was sitting in his palace in his own hometown, imprisoned by the servants of a French king, with a nobleman's hand raised against his face. In this pain, shame, and torment, the Pope Boniface abode prisoner among his enemies for 3 days. Then the people of Anagni, beholding their error and issuing from their blind ingratitude, suddenly rose in arms and drove out Chiara della Colonna and his followers, with loss to them of prisoners and slain, and freed the Pope and his household. He was free. He returned to Rome, and 1 month later, on October 11th, 1303, he was dead, broken, contemporaries said, by the shock and shame of what had been done to him. Who was this man? What did he claim that brought a king's soldiers to his bedroom? And what does his story tell us about the 5 centuries of conflict between the spiritual power of the Church and the temporal power of kings? A conflict that shaped the political landscape of the Western world in ways we are still living with today. The answer begins not in Anagni, but in Bologna, half a century before the humiliation, in the lecture halls of the greatest law school in Christendom, where a young man from a noble Italian family was learning the instrument that would make him, for 9 extraordinary years, the most powerful figure in the world. Benedetto Caetani was born at Anagni. His family had important political and ecclesiastical connections. He studied law at Spoleto and between 1263 and 1274 at Bologna, the center of legal studies in Christendom. Bologna was not merely a prestigious institution. It was the place where Roman law, the legal tradition of the ancient empire, rediscovered and recodified in the 11th and 12th centuries, was being systematized and applied to the governance of the medieval church and its relationship with secular power. A man who mastered law at Bologna had mastered the intellectual language of power. He understood how claims were made, how authority was justified, how disputes between competing jurisdictions were argued and resolved. In 1264, Benedetto received his first ecclesiastical appointment, a junior secretarial post in the legation of Cardinal Simon of Brie to France. In 1265, Benedetto joined another legation, led by Cardinal Boniface VIII, to England, where he remained probably until 1268. These early diplomatic missions, France and England in the 1260s, at a time when both kingdoms were navigating the turbulent aftermath of civil wars and baronial rebellions, gave the young canon lawyer something that legal study alone could not provide: a first-hand understanding of how secular power actually operated, how kings thought, what they feared, and what they would tolerate from Rome. It was an education that would prove both enormously useful and, ultimately, dangerously incomplete. He rose steadily through the curial hierarchy. By 1281, he was a cardinal deacon. By 1291, a cardinal priest. He served as papal legate in France and England. He was present at councils, negotiations, and diplomatic crises across Europe. He was described by a contemporary as a man of deep counsel, a man of trust, secret, industrious, circumspect. He was also, by temperament, bold, combative, and, in his latter years especially, prone to the kind of explosive anger that made enemies of people who might have been allies. And then, in 1294, came the episode that would cast a shadow over everything that followed. After the 6-month pontificate of the hermit Pope Celestine V ended with his resignation in December 1294, Benedetto Caetani was elected pope on December 24th, and he took the name Boniface VIII. Celestine V was one of the strangest figures ever to sit on the papal throne. He had been a hermit, a monk, a holy man of genuine ascetic simplicity who had founded the Celestine order and spent his adult life in mountain caves, far from the world of curial politics. He had continued to live like a monk in the papal apartments, even turning a room into the semblance of a monastic cell. He was, by virtually every account, a man of sincere personal holiness and catastrophic administrative incompetence. In 6 months, he had managed to create chaos in every corner of the church's governance, handing out benefices and appointments with the undiscriminating generosity of a man who did not understand what he was handing out or why it mattered. Benedetto Caetani was, maybe, instrumental in 1294 in persuading Celestine V to resign the papacy, and was elected in Celestine's place. The exact role Boniface played in engineering Celestine's resignation has been debated for 7 centuries. An anti-Bonifacian accusation circulated, impossible to verify, that Caetani had installed a speaking tube in the wall of Celestine's chamber and at night whispered through it the voice of God, urging the holy man to step down. Dante believed the worst version of the story. Dante places Celestine V as the coward beside the gate of hell who made the great refusal by abdicating the papacy and paving the way for Boniface's election. The legal reality was more complex. Celestine V abdicated by his own design after consultation with experts, and Benedetto merely showed that it was allowed by church law. He was, in other words, the lawyer who demonstrated that resignation was canonically permissible, and then, perhaps, used that knowledge to create the conditions in which resignation seemed the wisest course. Whether that constitutes manipulation or merely expert counsel is a question on which reasonable people differed then and differ now. What is beyond question is the immediate consequence. One of Boniface's first acts as pontiff was to imprison his predecessor in the castle of Fiumone in Ferentino, where he died on May 19, 1296 at the age of 81. The hermit pope died in a cell, and the cardinal who had arranged his departure now sat on the papal throne with enemies already circling. Enemies who would use the question of Celestine's resignation and the manner in which it had been obtained as a weapon against Boniface for the rest of his pontificate. The most dangerous of these enemies were the Colonnas. The Colonna family was one of the great baronial clans of Rome, with centuries of power, property, and papal connection behind them. 2 members of the family held cardinalships, and almost immediately after Boniface's election, they began to cause trouble, disputing the legitimacy of Celestine's resignation, challenging Boniface's authority, and in May 1297 committing the act that turned rivalry into war. An insurrection against Boniface by a section of the Colonna family culminated in the armed robbery of a large amount of papal treasure. Boniface's response was decisive and disproportionate. He stripped the Colonna cardinals of their rank and excommunicated them. He launched a military campaign against their strongholds, and he demolished the city of Palestrina, the family's great fortress town, in an act of such deliberate destructiveness that Dante, in the Inferno, names it specifically as one of Boniface's crimes. The Colonnas fled to France, where they found a patron who would, in time, use their hatred of Boniface with devastating effect. But in the immediate term, Boniface had prevailed, and by 1300, he had restored papal prestige to a level that seemed to vindicate every claim he was about to make. By 1300, Boniface had so successfully restored papal prestige that he proclaimed the first Jubilee year. The crowds who flocked to Rome to receive the indulgences that accompanied a papal blessing must have received the impression that the Church and the papacy were indeed at the greatest point of their power in history. The Jubilee of 1300, the first holy year in Christian history, was one of Boniface's most inspired inventions. He declared that pilgrims who came to Rome in that year and visited the tombs of the apostles would receive a plenary indulgence, full remission of the temporal punishment due to their sins. The response was overwhelming. His canonical and spiritual initiatives, especially the Liber Sextus and the Jubilee Holy Year, demonstrate his lasting influence on church law and devotional life. Hundreds of thousands of pilgrims poured into Rome from across Christendom. Contemporary accounts describe the Via Sacra so crowded that pilgrims had to walk in two regulated lanes, one approaching the basilica and one departing to prevent crushes. Giovanni Villani, a Florentine chronicler who was present, estimated that 200,000 pilgrims were in Rome at any given time during the year. Among those in Rome in the Jubilee year was Dante Alighieri, the Florentine poet who was still, in 1300, a man of some political influence in his city. He did not know, could not have known, that the man on the throne of Peter whom he saw presiding over this extraordinary spectacle of medieval piety was, in Dante's account, already damned. In Dante's Inferno, Pope Boniface VIII is placed in the eighth circle of hell with those who during their lives committed simony, the sin of buying or selling church offices. Dante wrote this while Boniface was still alive, an act of spiritual audacity, placing the reigning pope in hell before he had even died. The quarrel between Dante and Boniface was partly political. Boniface sent Charles of Valois to Florence in 1300 to intervene in the factional warfare between the Black and White Guelphs, and the intervention led directly to the triumph of the Black faction and to Dante's exile, under sentence of death, from the city he loved. But the quarrel was also theological and philosophical. Dante was at work on his treatise De Monarchia, arguing that the emperor derived his authority directly from God, not from the Pope, a direct counter to the claims that Boniface was about to make in his most consequential document. Boniface systematized canon law by collecting it in a new volume, the Liber Sextus, 1298, which continues to be important source material for canon lawyers. This legal codification, the sixth book of the great Corpus Juris Canonici, was a genuine intellectual achievement, organizing papal decretals from the decades since the previous compilation and demonstrating the growing sophistication of the Church's legal system. It was the work of a trained canonist who understood that authority required formal articulation, that power needed to be grounded in documented legal principle. And it was this impulse, the canonist's instinct to make explicit and formal what had previously been implicit and customary, that produced the Unam Sanctum. The conflict with Philip IV of France had begun in 1296, when Philip, engaged in expensive wars with England and Flanders, had imposed taxes on the French clergy without asking papal permission. In February 1296, Boniface issued the Bull Clericis Laicos, prohibiting lay taxation of clergy without papal approval, under penalty of excommunication. Philip's response was swift and economically devastating. He banned the export of all money and valuables from France, cutting off a significant stream of papal revenue. Philip IV retaliated by forbidding the export of all money from France, and in 1297 Boniface came to terms with Philip by recognizing the technicality known as necessity of state as reason for emergency taxation, even of clergy, by an imperiled secular government. It was a significant climb down. Boniface had issued a bull and then effectively retracted it under economic pressure. Philip had demonstrated that the papacy was not invulnerable to secular leverage. Both men had learned something, but they had learned different lessons. Boniface concluded that he had been insufficiently clear about the theological foundations of papal authority. Philip concluded that the pope could be pushed. For 4 years, an uneasy peace prevailed. And then, in 1301, Philip arrested the Bishop of Pamiers on charges of treason and heresy, claiming the right to try a churchman in a secular court, a direct challenge to the canonical principle of clerical immunity. Boniface responded by demanding that the bishop be released, summoning French bishops to Rome for a council to reform the French church, and warning Philip in a personal letter to submit to papal authority in spiritual matters or face the consequences. Philip responded by calling an assembly of the French estates, nobles, clergy, townspeople, and making his case to them directly. It was, in retrospect, a constitutionally revolutionary act, a king seeking the legitimacy of representative institutions rather than simply asserting royal prerogative. The French clergy, presented with the choice between their king and the distant pope, largely sided with their king. Boniface then did the thing that Philip's lawyers would use against him for the rest of the conflict. He called a council of French bishops and archbishops in Rome, and in November 1302, he issued the bull Unam Sanctum. On November 18, 1302, Boniface issued the bull Unam Sanctum. It declared that both spiritual and temporal power were under the Pope's jurisdiction, and that kings were subordinate to the power of the Roman pontiff. The document is the most radical formal statement of papal supremacy in the entire history of the medieval papacy. The conclusion of the bull is its most famous and most contested passage. Therefore, if the earthly power errs, it shall be judged by the spiritual power. If a lesser spiritual power errs, it shall be judged by its superior. But if the supreme spiritual power errs, it can be judged only by God, not by man. As the apostle witnesses, the spiritual man judgeth all things, and he himself is judged by no man. And then the final declaration, we declare, say, define, and pronounce that it is absolutely necessary for the salvation of every human creature to be subject to the Roman pontiff. This needs to be understood in its precise medieval context. Boniface was not claiming the right to legislate in secular matters or to directly administer kingdoms. He was claiming a judicial authority, the right to judge and, if necessary, to condemn rulers for their sins, including sins committed in the exercise of their political office. The question was whether kings were accountable for their official acts directly to God, or indirectly through the Pope as God's representative on earth. But even this more precise formulation was, in 1302, a step too far for Philip IV and for the emerging national monarchies of Europe. Philip's advisors, Nogaret chief among them, immediately characterized Unam Sanctum not as a theological statement, but as a political assault on French sovereignty. They began assembling a dossier of charges against Boniface. The charges were, in the main, fabricated or grossly exaggerated. Historiography considers them slanderous, but they served their purpose. They placed Boniface on the defensive and provided Philip with the justification for calling a general council to try and depose the Pope. Boniface appeared to have good reason to hope for a favorable termination of the conflict, because Philip's army was shortly afterward disastrously defeated by a league of Flemish townspeople. The Battle of the Golden Spurs in 1302, in which Flemish infantry destroyed the flower of French knighthood, seemed to have weakened Philip's position considerably. Boniface was preparing to excommunicate the French king by name, which would have freed his subject from their obligation of obedience and potentially ignited a rebellion. Philip moved first. Boniface's plans to issue a personal sentence of excommunication against Philip were forestalled when Nogaret appeared in Anagni and seized Boniface on September 7, 1303. The force was relatively small, a few hundred soldiers and mercenaries, but it was enough. The papal palace at Anagni was not fortified for serious military resistance. The Pope's household was overwhelmed within hours. What followed was the scene with which we began: the old man on his throne, the demand for abdication, the refusal, the blow. He was not held captive for long. The people of Anagni, beholding their error and issuing from their blind ingratitude, suddenly rose in arms and drove out Sciarra della Colonna, and his followers, with loss to them of prisoners and slain, and freed the Pope and his household. After 3 days, the townspeople of Anagni, the Pope's own neighbors, who had initially stood aside or even collaborated, rose against the foreign soldiers and drove them out. It was a partial redemption, perhaps, but the damage was done. Boniface returned to Rome. He arrived at the Vatican physically and psychologically shattered. He returned to Rome a broken man and died just a month later, allegedly from the sheer shock and shame of the event. On October 11th, 1303, 34 days after the assault on Anagni, Pope Boniface VIII died. Philip was not finished. He pressured Boniface's immediate successors, Benedict XI, and then the French-born Clement V, to conduct a posthumous trial of Boniface on the accumulated charges of heresy and moral crime. King Philip IV pressured Pope Clement V of the Avignon papacy into staging a posthumous trial of Boniface. He was accused of heresy, but no verdict against him was delivered. The charges were eventually dropped, but the fact that they had been pressed, that a French king had nearly succeeded in having a dead pope condemned as a heretic, illustrated with unmistakable clarity how completely the balance of power had shifted. And the institutional consequences were immediate and lasting. Boniface's conflicts with the French king led to the papal curia being transferred from Rome to Avignon, France, ushering in the period known as the Avignon papacy, 1309–77. This in turn led to the Great Western Schism, 1378–1417, in which there were 2, and later 3, rival claims to the throne of St. Peter, each with his own following, his own college of cardinals, and his own administrative offices, but formally there was only one pope. The rivals of this pope are known today as antipopes. 70 years in Avignon, then the Great Schism, in which 3 men simultaneously claimed to be the legitimate successor of St. Peter. The institutional crisis of the Church from which it would not fully recover until the Council of Constance in 1417, in which many historians argue it never fully recovered from at all, since the damage to papal credibility opened the ground for the Protestant Reformation a century later. There was 3 categories of consequence from the long conflict between the papacy and secular power, of which Boniface's defeat is the culminating episode. The first is the destruction of papal prestige in the eyes of some people. Many pious Christians concluded that the popes had allowed political ambition to crowd out spiritual vocation, and the credibility of the papacy in religious matters was damaged by its failures in political ones. The second is the strengthening of nationalism. Philip IV's mobilization of French clergy and nobles against Boniface, the summoning of representative assemblies, the framing of the conflict as a defense of French sovereignty, all of this accelerated the development of a distinctly French national identity centered on the crown rather than on any universal spiritual authority. And the third is the intellectual stimulus. The conflict generated some of the most important political theory of the medieval period, as both sides worked to articulate the theoretical foundations of their claims. The recovery and systematic study of Roman law, the development of canon law, and the beginnings of a theory of secular political authority that did not derive from the Church. All of these were accelerated by the controversy that Boniface helped to ignite. Dante's Monarchia, written in explicit opposition to Boniface's claims, argued that the emperor derived his authority directly from God, without papal mediation, a position that would have enormous influence on subsequent political thought. Marsilius of Padua, writing a generation later, would push further. He argued that political authority derived from the people, not from God or Pope at all, an idea that would become foundational to modern democratic theory. The conflict between Boniface and Philip IV was thus not merely a political drama. It was a catalyst for the intellectual revolution that would, over the following 2 centuries, change the medieval world order to build something new in its place. What are we to make of Boniface VIII himself? He was, by every account, a man of formidable intelligence, genuine legal learning, and absolute certainty about the rightness of his own position. Historians view Boniface VIII as a symbol of the papacy's final attempt to assert universal political authority. His bold declarations in Unam Sanctum and dramatic downfall led to the Great Western Schism of 1378. His canonical and spiritual initiatives, especially the Liber Sextus and the Jubilee Holy Year, demonstrate his lasting influence on church law and devotional life. He was also, and this is important, not wrong about the theoretical claim he was making. The argument of Unam Sanctum was not an innovation. It was the systematization and formal declaration of a principle that had been developing in papal thought for 2 centuries, since Gregory VII first insisted that the Pope had the authority to judge and depose emperors. Innocent III had acted on this principle with considerable success. Boniface was not inventing a new claim. He was, characteristically, putting into precise legal language what previous popes had said in vaguer and more diplomatic terms. The problem was not the claim. The problem was the moment. The emerging national monarchies of France and England in the early 14th century were no longer the fragmented feudal kingdoms that Gregory VII had faced in the 11th century. They had professional bureaucracies, reliable tax systems, standing armies, and, crucially, the capacity to mobilize popular and noble sentiment around a national identity that competed with the universal identity of Christendom. Philip IV understood this. Pope Boniface VIII stands as one of the most compelling figures of the medieval papacy, ambitious, brilliant, combative, and ultimately overwhelmed by a changing world. His clash with Philip IV signaled a historic shift in the balance of power between church and state. Yet his contributions to canon law, his shaping of papal identity, and his imprint on medieval spirituality endure. His papacy captures a dramatic moment when the universal order of Christendom gave way to the political realities of a new age. He died on October 11th, 1303, in Rome. He was buried in St. Peter's Basilica in a grandiose tomb that he had designed himself. He had prepared his own monument, with the thoroughness of a man who intended to be remembered. He would have been surprised, perhaps, to discover that what he is most remembered for is not the Jubilee or the Liber Sextus or the magnificent legal architecture of Unam Sanctum, but the scene in a small town in the hills south of Rome on a September morning in 1303, when a king's soldiers broke down his door and a nobleman's hand was raised against his face. It is, in the end, the right image. Not because it defines who Boniface was. He was more complex, more learned, more genuinely consequential than any single scene can convey. But because it defines the moment he represents, the moment when the medieval papacy's claim to universal temporal authority met the modern state, and the state won. Not just for Philip IV, not just for France, but for the political order that would govern the Western world from that September morning to the present day. Thanks for watching. See you next time with another human story